Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Death Row Welcomes You, Visiting Hours in the Shadow of the Execution Chamber, by Steven Hale, narrated by Tim Fannon. But if people are shown the machine, made to touch the wood and steel and to hear the sound of a head falling, then public imagination, suddenly awakened, will repudiate both the vocabulary and the penalty. Albert Camus, Reflections on the Guillotine. Prisons do not disappear problems. They disappear human beings. Angela Davis, Masked Racism, Reflections on the Prison Industrial Complex. Introduction. The first execution I remember being aware of is the lethal injection of Timothy McVeigh. I was 13 when the Oklahoma City bomber was put to death at the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, on June 11, 2001. I cannot claim to have had any precocious thoughts about his crime. Blowing up a federal building, killing 168 people, including 19 children, or his punishment. I remember the pictures of him that appeared on the television and in the newspaper, his gaunt face and sunken eyes topped with a military-style crew cut, an orange prison uniform hanging on his lean frame. I remember the way his surname's second syllable sounded menacing to my young ears, and that the words lethal injection conjured for me the image of a hooded man approaching him with a cartoonishly large needle. I never imagined then that I would witness the strange horror of executions myself, or that I would come to know some of the men condemned to them. I grew up in a conservative Christian home on the east coast of Florida, a state with a long history of grisly executions, of which it is not particularly ashamed. But if the death penalty ever came up in our house, I don't remember it. I believe my parents would have told a pollster at the time that they supported capital punishment in certain cases. It was not an animating political or religious issue for them, and so it was not a subject on which I felt I inherited a position. They did, however, raise my sister and me in the church, and into a sincere Christian faith. Despite growing up in a community whose politics tended toward the law and order right, I heard far more about the grace of Jesus Christ growing up than I did the state's duty to repay killing with killing. I suppose this is why, at some point in my teenage years, I came to the belief that an earth as it was in heaven would not include the execution of prisoners, if it had any prisoners at all. Still, the death penalty remained largely abstract to me, the subject of the occasional adolescent philosophical debate. Nearly 500 executions were carried out in the United States between McVeigh's in 2001 and the day I graduated college. 485 men and 4 women strapped to a gurney or an electric chair, and I don't recall being aware of a single one. That changed in the late summer of 2011. My wife and I were fresh out of college, newly married, and living in a small condo on the west side of Nashville, Tennessee. She was working nights as a nurse. I was working at a sandwich shop and writing as a freelancer for 2 local publications, the since-shuttered City Paper and the alt-weekly Nashville Scene. On the evening of September 21st, I was scrolling through Twitter when I started seeing reports from the preposterously named Georgia Diagnostic and Classification State Prison, where a black man named Troy Davis was set to be executed for the 1989 murder of a police officer in Savannah, Georgia. He'd also been convicted of shooting a man and assaulting another, but for more than 20 years he'd maintained his innocence. I pulled up a live stream of Democracy Now! And watched Wrapped as host Amy Goodman reported from outside the prison, where crowds were gathered waiting to find out if Davis had been put to death or granted an 11th-hour reprieve. In the end, it would be both. After the appointed hour came and went, word came that Davis was still alive, and that the execution had been delayed, pending a review of his petition for a stay by the Supreme Court of the United States. Several hours later, though, the court denied his request. In a final statement, he expressed condolences to the victim's family, declared his innocence one last time, and asked God to have mercy on those about to execute him. Davis was declared dead shortly after midnight in the Central Time Zone, where I was still following on my laptop. The experience lingered with me like a stubborn cold. I was troubled by the possibility that Georgia had executed a man for a crime he didn't commit. But I had not followed the case closely up to that point, and I felt ill-equipped to take a firm stance on his guilt or innocence. I was compelled, though, by the activists and journalists who had insisted that the nation, and the world even, knew what the state of Georgia was doing, that it was killing a man behind closed doors. 3 years later, Tennessee was planning to do the same, and I was preparing to go behind those doors. The state was set to execute a man named Billy Ray Irick, and I, then a staff writer at The Scene, had been selected as one of 7 members of the media who would witness it. I'd volunteered without much hesitation, but the truth is I had done very little research on the case, or the man at the center of it. I hadn't the slightest idea how Billy Ray Irick became the sort of man capable of the unfathomable crime that sent him to death row, nor the faintest sense of who he'd become in the decades since. I did know that he was one of 10 men on Tennessee's death row who were suing the state over the constitutionality of its then newly adopted and heavily shrouded lethal injection protocol. That was the basis for an order from the Supreme Court of Tennessee on September 25, 2014, calling off the execution, which was then less than 2 weeks away. I was relieved, but the state's invitation to the execution chamber would come again soon. In January 2018, the state Supreme Court set a new execution date for Irick later that year, a date the executioners would keep. Over the next 2 years, Tennessee would execute 7 men, and on 3 occasions I went to the execution chamber to watch them do it. It was an execution spree unseen in Tennessee since the 1940s. As that streak of state killings was just beginning, though, I also received another invitation, this one to the Death Row Visitation Gallery. It turns out that for many years, a quiet community has existed in the shadow of Tennessee's execution chamber, one made up of death row prisoners and the men and women who visit them regularly. As I would learn, these gatherings are so ordinary as to be extraordinary, and so life-giving as to feel defiant. They prove, I would come to see, that the very premise of death row is false. This book is, in large part, the story of evenings spent in those 2 places, the execution chamber and the visitation gallery, and the lives of the people I have encountered in each of them. It is an attempt to show what our death penalty system has been built to obscure, the true horror of executions, and the full, beautiful, and painful humanity of the condemned. And it is an account of how I went from writing about the men on death row to becoming friends with one of them. The people, experiences, and research that make up this book have changed my life. I hope that by preserving them here I can contribute in some small way to the idea that we are, all of us, capable of terrible and beautiful things, that people are so often harmed before they harm others, and that, as the lawyer and activist Brian Stevenson says, Each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. This is the story of how I went to death row and found I was welcome. 1. Tennessee houses and kills its condemned men at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution, a prison that disturbs an otherwise peaceful field around 10 miles from downtown Nashville. The collection of beige buildings sits in a bend of the Cumberland River, a bit of geography that gives the institution the only part of its name that isn't draped in euphemism. In the evenings, turkeys and deer meander in and out of the glare of floodlights on the perimeter of the grounds, unbothered by the razor wire fencing that surrounds the prison and seemingly oblivious to what it implies. I went to Riverbend for the first time on August 9, 2018, to witness the revival of Tennessee's death penalty, the lethal injection of a man named Billy Ray Irick. When the state kills someone, the law requires them to let a small group of people watch them do it. Prison officials solicit applications for media witnesses, which, as if to signal the archaic nature of the whole exercise, must be submitted by fax. There is a drawing to select 7 reporters to be admitted to the execution. I was one of the winners, chosen to witness the execution for The Scene. It had been nearly 10 years since the state had executed one of its prisoners. So-called capital punishment had been steadily declining in the United States since the 1990s, with a number of states abolishing the practice, and others allowing their death chambers to go dormant. In 2017, only 8 states carried out executions for a total of 23, the second fewest in the United States in 25 years. But Tennessee was now going the other way. Its hiatus had not been the result of a merciful impulse, but a mere delay caused by a series of legal and logistical dams which had now burst, allowing the river of retribution to flow. It was still light out, just before 5 p.m., when I turned onto a long winding driveway that led to the prison. An official checked my ID while a German shepherd sniffed around the outside of my car for signs of contraband. Armed officers waved me on. In the prison's parking lot, a large white canopy tent and a wooden lectern marked the spot where we would hold a press conference to describe the execution after it was finished. To the hundreds of men inside, looking out through thin vertical windows, we must have looked like vultures descending on a carcass. I parked in between 2 satellite trucks and sat in my car for 15 or 20 minutes. I felt weighed down in my seat by the crime and the punishment that had brought us there. Nearly 33 years earlier, Irick had raped and murdered a little girl named Paula Dyer, a 7-year-old he'd been left to babysit. Paula's mother and other members of her family were at the prison now, too, waiting for the state to deliver what it had promised, an act it claimed would bring justice. The details of the crime and the image of a girl too young to know what human beings could do to one another had been on an endless scroll in my mind for months as I reported on the upcoming execution. Alongside those facts were others. Details of Irick's lifelong severe mental illness and the brutal abuse he'd endured as a child. There was also the near certainty among medical experts that we were about to watch him be tortured to death. Soon, the Tennessee Department of Corrections communications director, our chaperone for a night at the death house, gathered us in the parking lot and led us inside the prison. The entryway smelled of fresh paint. Still visible brushstrokes on the walls betrayed a hasty whitewash in preparation for the arrival of what some men on the inside call free world people. Prison officers directed us through a security checkpoint, sending our shoes and jackets through an X-ray machine and us through a metal detector and full body scanner. We were there to see a homicide, but first they had to make sure we didn't have anything in our pockets. On the walls, framed placards declared the Department of Corrections' guiding principles and offered information about the exciting opportunities available to staff. From security, we were led into the first of 2 holding rooms we'd spend time in on the way to the execution chamber. A small conference room with light blue cinder block walls and a long wooden table. Prison staff brought us our notepads and pencils, as we'd been prohibited from bringing any reporting materials inside. They also offered us bottled water and coffee, a kind and unsettling gesture. Should one accept a cup of coffee at the gallows? In any case, I did. 3 men joined us in the conference room. IRIC's longtime attorney, Gene Shiles, Deputy Attorney General Scott Sutherland, and Sheriff Jimmy J.J. Jones, who was there to represent Knox County, where IRIC had been convicted. Jones, who wore his uniform with his gray hair parted in the middle, framing a round face, was new to me, but I was familiar with Sutherland. Weeks earlier, the state's execution method had gone on trial. After difficulty obtaining its preferred lethal injection drug, pentobarbital, Tennessee had adopted a new protocol that called for the use of a 3-drug cocktail. Midazolam, to sedate the prisoner, vecuronium bromide, to paralyze them, and potassium chloride, to stop their heart. In a lawsuit citing warnings from the state's own associates and the results of executions using similar protocols in other states, attorneys representing 33 condemned men argued that Tennessee's new protocol would amount to cruel and unusual punishment. One leading anesthesiologist testified that there was no debate about the fact that midazolam was not sufficient to prevent a person from experiencing the torturous effects of the next 2 drugs, which he likened to being buried alive and then being burned alive, all while paralyzed. Sutherland had argued the state's case, dismissing the horrifying testimony of medical experts as hyperbole, and emphasizing that the Constitution does not require executions to be painless. Crucially, he argued that the death row plaintiffs had not met the legal burden established by the U.S. Supreme Court in Glossop v. Gross, which held that death row prisoners challenging an execution method must provide a feasible and available alternative, a sort of bring-your-own-execution method rule. In many ways, the trial was not so different from the lethal injection we were about to witness. Barbarism dressed as bureaucracy, and armed with legal jargon. I'd sat in the court gallery, listening as the state's lawyers split legal hairs over whether a certain amount of pain becomes cruel or unusual, making arguments whose logic could only work in a cruel and unusual society. The judge, hearing the case, upheld the protocol as constitutional. IRIC's attorneys asked the U.S. Supreme Court to stay his execution so they could have more time to appeal the decision. But the court denied that request, over the objection of Justice Sonia Sotomayor. In refusing to grant IRIC a stay, the court today turns a blind eye to a proven likelihood that the state of Tennessee is on the verge of inflicting several minutes of torturous pain on an inmate in its custody, while shrouding his suffering behind a veneer of paralysis, Sotomayor wrote. If the law permits this execution to go forward, in spite of the horrific final minutes that IRIC may well experience, then we have stopped being a civilized nation and accepted barbarism. I dissent. The sheriff and the deputy attorney general weren't interested in talking while we waited to be led to the execution chamber. But Shiles, a gentleman with a warm southern accent who'd represented IRIC for more than 20 years, was more than willing. What else was left for him to do? Neither the courts nor then-Governor Bill Haslam was stepping in to stop the execution. The attorney's face showed the strain of the years he'd spent fighting on behalf of someone society had cast off as a monster. He mourned Paula Dyer, and he mourned Billy Ray Irick, and it was clear that for him these were not at all contradictory feelings. It was all tragedy, all loss. Irick had now spent more years on death row than he had in the outside world, and his life before death row had been consumed by darkness. I don't know if there's been one day in his whole life when his life was celebrated, Shiles said. Even the day he was born, I don't think, was a happy day. His sadness was mixed with shock. Holding a folder stuffed with papers, he referred to Irick's long history of severe mental illness, a history that had prompted calls for mercy from state and national mental health advocacy organizations. Shiles said he didn't truly believe the execution would happen until the Supreme Court had denied Irick's request for a stay earlier that afternoon, forcing Shiles to go to his client and tell him no one was going to spare his life. "I thought someone would look at the facts," he told me. At some point, time I found was hard to track inside the prison, we were told it was time to move on. Our chaperones led us out of the entry building and down a narrow sidewalk toward a large chain-link gate topped with razor wire. We waited as the gate opened in front of us, allowing us to crowd into a small piece of sidewalk between the first gate and a second identical one, which would not open until the first one had closed. Stretching out to our left was a long gravel path in between the two fences that formed a waterless moat between the prison units and the outer rim of the facility. Once the gate opened in front of us, we were led into another building, down a hallway, and into another conference room. The sounds of heavy doors slamming shut and walkie-talkies crackling echoed outside the room. We waited. Eventually, the officer who'd been leading us through the prison looked up from where she was standing at the door and asked, "You guys ready?" She didn't wait for an answer. We walked out of the room and into a large visitation gallery used by the prison's general population. Small clusters of chairs filled the room where incarcerated men and their loved ones gather for visits, sharing snacks from the vending machines that line one of the gallery's walls. The death chamber is on the other side. Again, we walked through one door and huddled in a small closet-sized space, waiting for the door behind us to close before the door in front of us could open. And then we were there. In the small witness room, there were about a dozen chairs arranged in front of a large four-paneled window with a curtain drawn across it. A small digital clock on a phone that hung on the wall revealed the time, 6:43 p.m. We took our seats, and the lights were shut off. We sat in the dark, waiting for the killing to begin. I knew Billy Ray Irick as he was rendered in years of court filings, a catalog of the worst things he had ever done and the worst things that had ever been done to him. Those pages contained a roster of his demons and a record of their manifestations. Billy was the second of 4 children, born in Knoxville, Tennessee, in 1958, to a harsh, violent father and an unstable mother. He was rarely at peace with society, and society was rarely at peace with him. The first time someone raised questions about his mental health was when he was just 6 years old, nearly the same age Paula Dyer would be when he raped and strangled her to death. His school's principal referred him to the Knoxville Mental Health Center for an evaluation, hoping to determine whether his behavioral issues stemmed from emotional problems or some kind of organic brain damage. A clinical social worker at the Knoxville Mental Health Center who performed an initial assessment described 6-year-old Billy as overly aggressive. She noted that he apparently mistreats animals adding, "This is something that is particularly evident with his cat. He prowls and meddles a great deal at home and at school," she wrote. "He has for a couple of years been telling people outside the home that his mother mistreats him, that she ties him up with a rope and beats him." A psychologist who interviewed Billy around the same time wrote that the boy felt intense hostility toward his family, and that Billy tends to fear his own impulses. If his parents, Nancy Stevens and Clifford Eyrich, were willing and able to care for their son, it is not evident from the records of his childhood. The same social worker who first assessed Billy would later testify that his mother had psychiatric problems of her own and was just not able to function in the role of a parent for Billy. The staff at the Knoxville Mental Health Center became so convinced that the Eyrich home was degrading the boy's mental health that they had him hospitalized and later placed him in a residential school called the Church of God Home for Children, a former orphanage that provided care for abused and emotionally disturbed children. His parents rarely, if ever, visited him between the ages of 8 and 13. When they were reunited, it did not go well. Court documents bluntly summarize what took place during a home visit when Billy was 13. During the visit, Billy used an axe to destroy the family television set, clubbed flowers in the flower bed, and, in a very disturbing incident, used a razor to cut up the pajamas that his younger sister was wearing as she slept. The razor was later found in his sister's bed. Later, back at the home for children, he broke into the girls' dormitory and was discovered hovering over a sleeping girl. A knife was found in her bed. Billy was briefly hospitalized again, and after his discharge, the home for children would not take him back. Just entering his teenage years, he was like a transplanted organ repeatedly rejected by unsuitable bodies. Back at what was supposed to be home, he found no peace or love. His father, a Korean War veteran, beat him often. Years after Billy was sent to death row, a neighbor named Inez Prigmore told an investigator working on his case that she regularly heard Clifford Eyrich's verbal and physical abuse from her home 2 doors down. On one occasion, she said, she saw Billy's father hit him across the head with a 2x4. By the time he was 16, Billy had been expelled from school. At the urging of his father, he joined the army, but was discharged after only a few weeks. For years after he was kicked out of the military, Billy lived as a drifter, hitchhiking around the country and traveling as far as Alaska and Hawaii. It was during these years, he would later say, that he took a serious interest in Lakota Native American spiritual traditions. He worked as a short-order cook and a maintenance worker and did a stint on a fishing boat in the Gulf of Mexico. He would later describe those years, on the road with no permanent mooring, as the best years of his life. In 1983, after leaving the Gulf, Billy returned to the Knoxville area and found work washing dishes. While he was working 80-hour weeks in the kitchen at a truck stop, he crossed paths with Kenny Jeffers, a man he'd known as a child. Billy later lost his job when the truck stop closed down, and he set off with his backpack toward the highway again. He was making his way down the road when Kenny drove up alongside him and offered him a place to stay. Billy moved in with Kenny and his wife Kathy and their 5 children, including a little girl named Paula. Decades later, in an interview with a Knoxville TV station, WBIR, Kathy Jeffers would describe her daughter as an outgoing girl who loved to pick flowers and bring them to new neighbors. Billy's time living with the family was short and turbulent, but as Kathy would tell a local reporter decades later, he became part of the family. When Kathy and Kenny worked, Billy would watch the kids. For a brief time, he appeared to have a home and family relationships that were not deformed by illness, hostility, and violence. He was said to love the children as if they were his own, and they called him Uncle Bill. One night when the family's home caught fire, Uncle Bill saved 2 of the children's lives. when Kenny and Kathy divorced.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?